Ukrainian offensive to be considered a success, it would have to breach the Russian defenses. And by breaching, that means you have to penetrate all three layers and clear the Russians out of the other side of the final defensive line. Only then can you have considered to have breached it. Anything short of that, you're trapped in the Russian defensive system and you're going to die. And so the Ukrainians haven't even cleared the initial contact zone of the first line of defense. They haven't penetrated the first line of defense. It's doubtful whether they've even made contact with the first line of defense. They're being stopped well short by the barriers that the Russians have put in place and by the flexible defense tactics that the Russians are employing to absorb the Ukrainian attack. And so here we are 2 weeks into this counteroffensive. They haven't even reached the first line of defense.
Oh, boy.
And they've been tasked with breaching the Russian defensive systems. I will tell you right now that they don't stand a chance of succeeding. I doubt they'll ever reach the first line of defense. I doubt they'd ever penetrate the first line of defense. And I will put every dollar I'll ever make in my entire life on the fact that they will never breach the totality of the Russian defenses. This is going to end up as a strategic defeat, not only for Ukraine, but for its NATO sponsors. Remember, these brigades that Ukraine is using for this fight have been created for this very purpose. Right. They have been equipped by NATO. They have been trained by NATO. They are attacking where NATO has told them to attack. This attack has been war gamed out on a NATO computer simulation known as Cora. And every aspect of this fight has been played out, simulated. And I have to tell you, somebody who has an experience in doing this kind of simulation in preparation of the Marine Corps' breach of Iraqi defensive lines back in 1991, which was successful, by the way. I can tell you that you can't accurately and with integrity simulate the reality of this battlefield and come up with a solution that says Ukraine can win. And what I'm trying to say is that NATO has deceived the Ukrainians. NATO has done a war game that gave the Ukrainians a false sense of hope. NATO has willingly sent these Ukrainian soldiers to their death on the field of battle against the Russians.
So, Scott, I went into this, and perhaps you could elaborate. I talked about, because you mentioned these multiple layers of defense, and I was talking about Dragon's Teeth, the anti-tank ditches, or traps, pits, whatever, and then the zigzagged manned trenches for infantry position. So, I mean, are you saying basically that the Ukrainians are failing because of it's not a lack of equipment, a lack of training, it's insurmountable?
It's a combination of both. To be honest, I would never send, again, the units that should be used to carry out the assault breaching of a fortified defensive line should be highly trained units who are intimately familiar with the equipment that they're going to be using and the tactics that they're going to be employing.
And that's not the case, because these are new systems.
Yeah, giving the Ukrainians this NATO equipment at the last minute. Remember, they fell in on their equipment, their Bradleys and their Leopards, in January and February of this year, and then they were given rudimentary training at Grafenwohr and other NATO bases from the middle of January up until May. And then they were told to take this equipment and carry out the single most complicated assault mission imaginable. The Ukrainians don't know how to use their equipment. They're not familiar with it, especially in a combat tactical sense, where you need to be intimately familiar with every aspect of this equipment to make it do that which you not only want it to do, but which you're anticipating the necessity of doing.
Man.
You can't anticipate something if you don't understand the equipment you're in.
Yeah.
You don't know the weapon, you don't know how to operate it, don't know how it works. It's not seamless. There's no sixth sense taking place. They're simply driving a death trap to their imminent demise. The same thing with the Bradley. And even if they knew this equipment, they don't understand the tactics. They don't understand what they're supposed to be doing. And one of the reasons is because NATO has deceived them, because no commander in their right mind would allow themselves to initiate an assault breaching operation without considering all of the aspects of suppression. Suppression, there's a U.S. Army, mnemonic that they use for assault breaching, and the first letter is an S, and it stands for suppression, and suppression is the key. Without suppression, nothing else happens, because you have to suppress the enemy's artillery. You have to suppress the enemy's anti-tank missiles. You have to suppress their air power. You have to screen yourself so that you can begin the very dangerous task of working your way through these obstacle belts that you spoke of, the minefields, the dragon's teeth, the initial trench works, the screening forces. But to get to that first line of defense, and then you have to puncture that, clear the rear, and then move on. And you have to do that 3 times. And the whole time you have to do that, you have to suppress the enemy. There is no suppression taking place. It's not just the firepower. Electronic warfare is an important aspect of this, jamming the Russians' ability to communicate. Because if I'm a Russian in my trench line and here come the Ukrainians, and I'm trying to make contact with artillery to call in a fire mission, I shouldn't be allowed to do this. They should be jamming this signal. There should be no communication. I shouldn't be able to contact air power. But the Russians right now have seamless command and control. They're coordinating their fire support. The Ukrainians are walking into pre-designated kill zones where the artillery is just pounding down on them. The aircraft are coming in without any intervention. There's no air defense worthy of the name. And the Ukrainians are getting slaughtered, not just on the line of contact, but in the rear assembly areas. This was known. Anybody who knows anything, and I have to imagine that the NATO instructors are familiar with assault breaching operations. They wrote the darn book, that they should never have allowed this attack to take place because it's literally suicide. The only way you could justify this attack is if you artificially skewed the computer simulation so that the opponent ran away. I call it the Monty Python defense, search for the Holy Grail. Right. The white rabbit shows up and they run away. And basically the Ukrainians become the white rabbit and the Russians become the knights of the round table and they run away. That's the only way this simulation works, is if you give the Russians all of the negative attributes that I guess Ukrainian propaganda and Western propaganda has been putting on them. But what we found out is that everything that the West has been saying negative about the Russian troops is proven to be false. First of all, they built very impressive defensive positions. I remember when the Russians were first digging it, all of the bros and the fellas and anybody else you want to say online were mocking it. Look at that. Those dragon teeth are going to stop nothing. What are they digging lines behind for? What's the purpose of all this? It's called doctrine, guys. Doctrine. And the Russians executed it perfectly. And then they said, well, these mobilized forces, they can't fight. They have no morale, no training. They weren't trained.
They always said this thing about morale. There's no morale. Low
morale. And then Russian generals and colonels and majors, they're all drunk. They don't know what they're doing. There's no command and control. The Russians don't have to do anything. They blah, 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 blah. Turns out the Russians are perhaps the most professional force in Europe right now. Those mobilized guys, they're not only trained well, pretty damn brave, standing their ground. The Ukrainians are saying, we expect you to run away, and you guys are fighting for every square inch. And the Russians are smart about this. They let the Ukrainians come in, and they fix them. And then when the Ukrainians commit to where the Russians want them to commit, because the Russians will hold strong in one area, loosen in another, the Ukrainians will migrate to the loose. The Russians will pull back because they're not in the business of needlessly dying. Are the Russians suffering casualties? Putin has said so. 1 to 10, he said. 1 to 10. And that's a president who knows what he's talking about. That means for every 10 Ukrainian casualties, there's one Russian casualty. Now, right now, we're probably looking at around 10,000 Ukrainian dead.
Okay.
That means that the Russians have probably lost about 1,000 dead. That's
Only?
a lot of guys.
I mean, I know it's obviously a lot of people, but the ratio is incredible. I mean, how is that? How is that possible?
Because the Ukrainians aren't suppressing. Because the Ukrainians are literally.
I mean, they have no air force, right?
Of their force.
They have no air force.
The totality of their force is exposed to everything the Russians have. The Russians are able to come in with their air force, their fixed wing, their helicopters. They're able to employ their artillery. They're able to bring in their anti-tank screening forces and kill everything that moves. That's what's happening.
I mean, the thing I wanted to ask you, Scott, is that you know the Russians are defending a very, very long line, right? So I mean, you could argue that in one sense, I mean, perhaps another army would have they would have collapsed at one point, because it's a very long line if we consider all the defenses that they've built. The other thing I wanted to mention, the mud. This is mud season, and I thought Ukrainians would know their own weather, right? So you got vehicles getting bogged down and trapped.
Well, the weather is bad. It's clearing up now. We're in June, so the Rasputitsa, the muddy season, is either over or just about to be over. But you're right. The ground is still going to be soggy, especially when employing 62-ton Leopard tanks, which are not designed for unimproved roads. The small bridges that operate in this area of the world, the fields, it makes it difficult for the Leopards to maneuver. But the other thing is, it is a long line of defense. But understand that the Russians learned their lesson from last September, where they sought to hold a long line of contact with insufficient troops, and they had strong points with big gaps between them, not enough artillery to cover the gaps, and the Ukrainians were able to shoot the gaps and get into the Russian rear and cause a collapse of the Russian defenses. That's a strategy the Ukrainians appear to be trying to replicate right now, but the Russians have learn their lessons. We're not dealing with 180,000 Russian troops like we had back in September, October. We're dealing with around, I would say, between 500 and 700,000 Russian troops. Many of them aren't in the line of contact. They're being held in reserve, ready to counterattack, which is, the final part of the Russian defense doctrine, which is to absorb the attack of the attacking party, let them spend their combat power, and then at the moment of their greatest weakness, to launch a concerted counterattack to push them back and seize the offensive. So the Russians have about 220,000 troops that have yet to be committed into this fight, who are well-trained, equipped with the best equipment possible, and they're standing by, get the Red Star Cluster or Green Star Cluster or whatever the Russian signal is to advance. But meanwhile, the Russians have 450, 500,000 troops that they've put into these defensive positions that are not all in the front line. They're defending in depth, doctrine, and they have more than enough manpower to defend the totality of their space. The Ukrainians will not find any gaps, any weak spots.
I don't know, Scott. I heard differently on CNN and BBC. I heard the Russians are losing and they're failing, and the propaganda was really something. I mean, you alluded to it earlier. Bakhmut was also one of these stories, right? They kept saying the Russians are have not captured it and this and that. What do you think of Bakhmut? Because we can't talk about Ukraine and not discuss Bakhmut, because it's its longest battle in this war. What are your thoughts on the whole thing?
Well, keep in mind that the NATO forces that have been trained for this offensive, the 9 to 12 brigades, constitute around 50, 60,000 troops. The battle for Bakhmut cost Ukraine 75,000 dead. And if you don't understand that just ripped a gaping hole in the Ukrainian order of battle, and that was devastating to the morale of the Ukrainians, and that made it impossible for Ukraine to survive, literally, if they went and lost another 60,000, which they're preparing to do in this counteroffensive. Bakhmut will go down in the history of this conflict as one of the pivotal moments. It's where the back of the Ukrainian military was broken. by Wagner in the fighting for
Mm.
Bakhmut. This was bloody fighting. Wagner suffered, I think, an estimated 30,000 dead, which is a lot of dead.
Yeah.
But understand that Wagner was fighting in an urban environment. Normally, when you're on the attacking side, you want a 3-to-1 advantage over the defender. That means for every one defender, you need three of your guys. But
Okay.
Wagner's attacking a fortified urban target, which means that you would want to have 5 or 7-to-1 advantage. Wagner was attacking at a 1-to-3, 1-to-4 disadvantage. That is, for every 3 or 4 Ukrainian defenders, there was just one Wagner fighter.
So they're outnumbered.
They're outnumbered, but they had better tactics. They had better command and control, better operational sense. They had also, I think, a better fighting spirit. They were able to maintain pressure against the Ukrainians on a continuous basis, and they wore the Ukrainians down, and then they killed them. It's called the meat grinder for a reason. But the Wagner operation became a deliberate killing machine. Sometime, I would believe, in May, when it was clear that the Ukrainians were going to defend the Soledar Bakhmut complex. The decision was made not to focus on territorial gains, but on giving the Ukrainians the opportunity to reinforce and die. And that was the success of the Wagner operation, is that they pulled in tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who would otherwise be alive today and be able to support the counteroffensive that's underway. So Bakhmut ripped the heart out of the Ukrainian army even before this counteroffensive began.
There's this new decree, shall we say, that was issued by Putin that members of Wagner and other auxiliary forces, shall we put it, have to sign an agreement to fully integrate into the Russian armed forces. And Prigozhin is saying that no one's going to sign a single contract. Do you see a power struggle here between Shoigu, the defense minister, and Prigozhin? Because you've seen the videos and the messages where he's trashing them and saying you're not giving us enough support. But now that they have to sign this contract,
I think a lot of what Prigozhin was doing during the actual battle was part of a psychological warfare operation against the Ukrainians. To create the perception of disunity, disharmony, weakness, so that the Ukrainians wouldn't withdraw from Bakhmut, but double down on stupid and say, we have a chance to win. All we have to do is push and Wagner will collapse because they have this dysfunction. But I think the source of the dysfunction is real. I think there's real dissatisfaction between elements of Wagner and the Russian Ministry of Defense. Wagner was created as a unique contracting vehicle to provide military expertise to the militias of the Donbass and Donetsk and Lugansk at a time when the territory was Ukrainian, and Russia is constitutionally prohibited from providing military forces. They can't deploy the regular Russian army onto Ukrainian soil. So Wagner was created. People call it a mercenary outfit. It's not a mercenary outfit. Mercenaries don't die for their country. Mercenaries fight for money.
Right.
And the purpose of mercenaries are to live and go spend that money. Wagner is composed of 100% Russian patriots, people who are ready to lay their lives down for their country, but they operate on a different contractual basis than the regular army because legally that's what has to happen. But, one thing that has happened is that now that Lugansk and Donetsk have been absorbed by Russia and now Russian territories, and now that Russia has had a chance to harmonize Russian legal structures with those two territories, Wagner no longer operates within the framework of the Russian Constitution or Russian law. You can't be a private military contractor. Now, what complicates this further is the fact that the private military contractor is just a contractual subterfuge. Wagner, I believe, works for Russian military intelligence, the GRU, and takes its orders from the Russian General Staff. It's a specialized combat unit for specialized tasks and purposes. And I do believe that if Wagner is going to continue to operate on Russian soil, that there will have to be um, a legal normalization of Wagner. But you want to do this in a manner that doesn't compromise that which makes Wagner special. And that is, of course, its unique command structure, very streamlined command procedures, and the esprit de corps that comes with having a military system that's based upon a meritocracy where the most qualified people rise to the top, and competence is treasured overall. And that's why Wagner's not in the front lines right now, because Wagner has until August. I think August 5th is when Prigozhin said they'll be reintroduced to get their act together. And if they don't, I don't think Wagner will be reintroduced. I don't see Wagner. Prigozhin isn't going to get his way. That's the bottom line. Either Wagner as an institution or each individual member of Wagner will be compelled to enter into a legally binding relationship with the Russian government that is consistent with the Constitution of Russia. This is an absolute prerequisite, and it will happen because the Russian military understands that Wagner is a unique asset that is, well positioned to provide lethal battlefield support. It's a force multiplier, and there are going to be future battles in well-defined geographical areas where having Wagner take over that sector would be to the benefit of Russia. So I see them solving this problem, but there is a problem between Prigozhin and Shoigu. Prigozhin's made it personal, and he's going to have to either back down or move out of the way. But let's just make this clear. Prigozhin, I don't believe he has any ambition of challenging Putin. That is ludicrous. But B, if he were, he wouldn't survive very long. And I'm not saying dying. I'm just saying that Prigozhin has to understand that he exists because of Putin, and Putin can make all that which defines Prigozhin go away that quick. And if Prigozhin doubts it, he just needs to pick up the phone and call Khodorkovsky in London and say, "Hey, how'd that work out when you took on Putin? What happened? You went to jail for a long time, right? Now you're in exile. Yeah, that worked out really well for you." It won't work out for Prigozhin, so Prigozhin's going to have to tone it down.
Yeah, I certainly didn't think that Putin would enter the discussion. I thought maybe Shoigu, because he usually I get the vibes of Sudan, where you have Dagalo, who with his rapid strike forces, and after Bashir was gone out of the picture, it's because his rapid strike forces were also in the army, but not really. It's kind of like Wagner. But anyway, I was wondering if you heard yesterday Shoigu's speech. He was talking about the United States and UK striking Crimea or planning to strike Crimea, and he singled out the HIMARS system, and he singled out the Storm Shadow system. So those are our things. And he was saying that if you do this, if you hit Crimea, this is going to be outside the scope of the special military operation. So it was like he was essentially saying that we will consider this a declaration of war, right?
He said that we will recognize you as parties to the conflict, but then he said that Russia will strike back at decision-making centers in Ukraine. So
I thought this was already the case.
Again, no. The fact that that Zelensky is able to live, the fact that the Ukrainian parliament is able to meet, the fact that
I meant that we're parties to the conflict. I thought that was clear to them.
The fact that any of these Ukrainian personalities can get on TV and be photographed is proof positive that Russia has not made the concerted decision to suppress Ukrainian command and control, Ukrainian decision-making centers. They have on limited occasions struck against select targets in retaliation for select deeds. But I think what Shoigu is saying here is that should Ukraine use these American and British supplied weapon systems against Crimea, that all restrictions against decision-making targets will be lifted. And it's just sort of a polite way of saying we're going to kill you all, because that's what will happen. They will strike every place these people are hiding, every place they operate, and there will no longer be freedom to govern Ukraine as they see fit. The government will be hiding in holes in the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I meant that we are already parties to the conflict. I thought that much was clear. But the level of escalation is getting more and more dangerous. And did you see the peace treaty or draft peace treaty that Putin held up when the African delegation arrived in to see first Zelensky and then him? And he said that we signed this over a year ago. So this was already signed by the Ukrainian delegation, and at the time it was understood that the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson went down and told Zelensky to pull out. I mean, this whole war could have been over a year ago already, over a year ago. What happened here?
Well, remember, let's back up even further. When France and Germany and Ukraine pulled out of Minsk effectively in October of 2021, they shut the door on what could have been an automatic peace environment. And think of it today. What are the Ukrainians demanding of Russia? They're demanding that Russia gets out of all of their territories. Now, the Ukrainians have suggested that Crimea could be up for negotiation. So had the Ukrainians accepted Minsk, they'd be getting the same thing that they're now sacrificing hundreds of thousands of their troops to accomplish. Yeah. But it was Ukraine that, and together with Germany and France, that pulled out of Minsk. Then Russia turned around and said, well, if we're not going to do Minsk, let's do a new European security framework. And they put two draft treaties on the table, one for NATO, one for the United States, and said, let's talk about this. But they were ignored. So they had no choice but to carry out a preemptive act of self-defense, which is legitimized under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Now, here's the interesting thing. People say, well, where's the evidence of that, Ritter? Well, I don't have it. I mean, it's been hinted at, suggested, but people are saying because the Russians didn't put it out there, it can't exist. I think what Putin just did is prove that the Russians don't say something unless they have documented fact. The Russians said early on that the Ukrainians had agreed to this, but the Ukrainians were denying. Putin has now put out documented fact, what the Ukrainians did. And the Russians are sitting on this. I think the Russians have to do a better job of information warfare, especially when it comes to establishing who is responsible for this war, because it's not Russia. Russia is not responsible for this war. NATO is responsible. The United States is responsible. England is responsible. Germany is responsible. France is responsible. Ukraine is responsible. These are the responsible parties to this conflict. Russia was backed into a corner and literally had no other choice. Had Russia not intervened when it did, there's every reason to believe that in the first week of March of 2022, the Ukrainians would have launched an assault with overwhelming force. Remember, NATO has been training the Ukrainian military since 2015. And this NATO-trained army was assembling in the Donbass, ready to carry out an offensive strike against the breakaway areas of Donetsk and Lugansk. That's why Russia launched a preemptive strike to nullify that and then put Ukraine in a position where it would have to consider terms of surrender. That was the whole purpose of the special military operation. It wasn't to steamroll the Ukrainian army, take Kiev, etc. It was to create the perception of danger sufficient enough to get the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, which Russia did within 3 days of the war starting. Ukraine was negotiating in Gomel, Belarus, and then get them to conclude a peace treaty that met some of Russia's primary goals and objectives, which the Ukrainians signed off on and should have been implementing on 1 April. But NATO intervened, pulled the plug on that. These were decisions made by NATO, made by Ukraine, not by Russia. Russia didn't want to be involved in this war, but here we are today. But the reality is that Russia has in effect ceded the information warfare theater of operations to Ukraine and the United States, who are in the business of just flooding the zone, so to speak, with this information. Now, the Russian strategy, again, I can't defend it because I don't know their reasoning, but I will tell you this. Russian reality is becoming readily visible to everybody, meaning that everything Russia has said is coming true. The Ukrainians are Nazis. There can no longer be a debate about this. We see the odious